Some events in life crash down like a sudden storm, leaving behind chaos that cannot be ordered. I remember the day Ben returned to our house as if it were yesterday. Mark, my husband, announced it in passing, without any explanations or apologies, as he always did. Ben is moving in with us for a while, Mark said at dinner, not even looking in my direction. He held the phone in one hand, casually scrolling through the news feed. He needs to recover after all this. After what? A breakup? Mark waved his hand dismissively, as if that word explained everything. It's temporary. Don't worry. Don't worry. Those two words had haunted me for the past 10 years of marriage. When Mark made decisions, they were inevitably accompanied by that phrase, as if my opinion didn't matter at all. Ben appeared on our doorstep 2 days later. He was taller than I remembered, with dark hair falling on his forehead and those same thoughtful eyes that stood out against his angular features. In his hands, he held a worn suitcase and a pair of sneakers slung over his shoulder. Hi. His voice was deep, calm. Ben had always been a man of few words, like his father. Welcome, I replied with effort, forcing a smile. He nodded, not noticing my awkwardness, and stepped over the threshold like a person returning to a past he couldn't escape. In the kitchen, Mark gave him a formal reception. Make yourself at home, son. Son. I barely heard Mark use that word throughout our marriage. It seemed like he suddenly remembered that Ben was his flesh and blood, not just someone from his old life. My life was divided into two parts, before Ben and after. In the first version, I was the mistress of the house, a wife for whom the world was understandable and measured, even if a little boring. In the second version, Ben entered our house, bringing with him shadows of something unexplored and disturbing. The first days passed surprisingly calmly. Ben was almost invisible. He sat silently in the living room, listened to music in his headphones, or left the house without saying where he was going. Mark and I maintained the illusion of normality, as if no ghost from the past had settled in our home. But something changed that Wednesday. I was in my bedroom, getting ready for a party at Lily's. My best friend. We hadn't seen each other in a long time, and I decided to wear a new dress that I had ordered a month ago. I stood in front of the mirror in my underwear, looking at my reflection with slight disappointment. The dress didn't fit as I expected. It seemed too tight at the waist, too loose at the chest. I sighed and pulled it over my head, throwing it on the bed. At that moment, the bedroom door swung open. Emma, you... I froze, seeing Ben in the doorway. His eyes widened in surprise, and he immediately looked away, but not before a tense pause arose between us. Long, awkward, frozen in time. Sorry, he muttered, backing away, his cheeks flushed. I thought Mark was here. The door closed with a dull thud, leaving me alone in the room with my heart pounding wildly. I grabbed a robe and threw it over my shoulders, feeling my hands tremble. It was just a moment, just a few seconds, but there was something in it that made the air in the room heavy and impenetrable. In the evening at dinner, everything was as usual. Mark talked about work as if nothing had happened. Ben sat across from me, his gaze fixed on his plate. I forced myself not to look at him, but every time I looked up, he seemed to feel it and quickly looked away. Emma, are you going with Lily tomorrow? Mark asked, putting down his fork. Yes, I replied automatically. My voice was too even, too calm. Good, I'll be late at work. Ben, maybe you can help around the house while I'm gone? Ben nodded without looking up. After dinner, I went to the bedroom, but even there I felt his presence, like an echo of a brief glance that couldn't be erased from memory. I sat on the bed holding a book in my hands, but the words didn't form sentences. The knock on the door was unexpected. Yes? I said, trying to control my voice. Ben peeked into the room, his gaze cautious. I wanted to apologize for today. I shouldn't have. It's okay. I interrupted him faster than I wanted to. It was an accident. He nodded, his eyes lingering on me a second longer than they should have. Good night, he muttered and closed the door. When I was alone, I suddenly realized that I was holding the book so tightly that my fingers had turned white. Inside me, something stirred, something I was afraid to admit even to myself. The next day, silence reigned in the house. Mark went to work, leaving Ben and me alone. I tried to act as usual, doing the cleaning, but every rustle and sound in the house echoed. Ben sat in the living room, his figure relaxed but also tense like a spring. I entered with a laundry basket and paused for a moment when he looked up at me. Good morning, I said, trying to sound casual. Morning, he replied, his voice low and even. I started sorting the laundry, feeling his gaze on me. It wasn't harsh or intense, more studying. Finally, I couldn't stand the silence. How are you feeling? I asked without looking up. Ben didn't answer right away. I heard him sigh. Normal, I guess, better than before. I nodded and went back to sorting, but his voice interrupted my thoughts. Have you ever felt like you're stuck? Like you're living someone else's life? I froze, my fingers clutching the fabric. Sometime, I replied quietly. And what do you do about it? I looked up and met his gaze. It was direct, frank, full of something I couldn't quite understand. I try not to think about it. Ben smiled with the corner of his lips, but there was no joy in his eyes. Not thinking about it isn't a solution. I didn't reply. Instead, I returned to my chores, but Ben's words settled in my head like seeds waiting for the right moment to sprout. The silence between us became different, filled with something elusive. It started with little things, his hands accidentally touching my fingers when we passed each other dishes, his gaze lingering a little longer than it should before he looked away. But one evening, everything changed. Mark stayed late at work, and I was alone in the living room. I sat on the couch with a book in my hands, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Ben appeared in the doorway, his steps soft. Can't sleep, he said simply. Me neither. He sat down next to me, at the other end of the couch. The distance between us was small, but it seemed filled with something invisible and unbearably heavy. I heard him exhale slowly, and for some reason, it made my heart beat faster. I tried to focus on the book, but the pages blurred before my eyes. The air grew thicker with each minute, and I felt my body tense from his silent presence. I noticed him out of the corner of my eye, how he shifted slightly, placing his hand on the back of the couch. My skin suddenly began to tingle, as if from the closeness of his breath, which I didn't even hear. I pulled myself together and buried myself in the book, but my fingers trembled slightly on its spine. Are you okay? He asked unexpectedly, his voice soft but stirring something vague inside me. Yes, I replied, but my voice sounded unnaturally quiet. I couldn't make myself look up to meet his gaze. At some point, he reached for the remote, and our fingers touched. The sensation was as unexpected as it was lightning fast. I pulled my hand away, but Ben didn't look away. His gaze was direct, deep, almost studying. Emma, he said softly. I felt a shiver run down my skin. We shouldn't. I began, but my voice faltered. He slowly moved closer, his movements almost hesitant, but desperately confident at the same time. I froze, my heart pounding in my throat, and my skin seemed to absorb every particle of his closeness. Every cell in my body screamed to leave, but my feet didn't move, and my hands remained motionless on my knees. We were so close that I could feel his warmth, like an elusive fire, gradually approaching what I was used to considering myself. I could hear his breathing, quiet but deep, and for some reason, that scared me the most. What did he see in me now? And why couldn't I make myself look away? My mind told me it was wrong, but in that moment, between his cautious movement and my traitorous anticipation, there was something I couldn't tear myself away from. Something forbidden, inexplicable, and frighteningly alluring. Instead, I held my breath when he gently touched my cheek. His touch was soft, but there was a barely restrained strength in it. The tips of his fingers gently slid down my cheek, as if he was afraid to break the fragility of that moment. I felt a shiver run down my skin, from my temple to my shoulder, and everything inside me seemed to tighten. A warm, lingering feeling arose in my chest, which I couldn't explain. It was frightening and alluring at the same time. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat, while he didn't take his hand away, but the trace of his touch remained, like a hot imprint, burning my skin and mind. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to silence the voice of reason telling me it was wrong, But in that silence, I only heard the beating of my own heart, fast, desperate, and alien. Emma, he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. Between us, there were no words, only the feeling of closeness that shattered all the boundaries I once thought were insurmountable. It was a moment that changed everything. After that night, something inside me changed. I woke up in the morning with a heavy feeling, as if something important had happened, and I hadn't noticed how. I avoided Ben, but every step around the house, every glance caught by chance in the kitchen or hallway, seemed filled with unspoken words. On Sunday, Mark went away on business again. The house was emptier and quieter than ever before. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, trying to focus on a book, but my thoughts were scattered. The sound of the door made me jump. Ben came out onto the porch, his hands in his pockets, his gaze casual but too focused on me. He sat down next to me on the steps. "Nice day," he muttered, looking at the garden in front of us. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the cup, but my heart was beating wildly again. His closeness was tangible, even despite the distance. "Are you okay here?" he asked unexpectedly. I looked up, surprised by his question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, looking into the distance. "Just, you look like you don't even know what you want." His words hit the mark. I didn't answer. Instead, I took a sip of coffee, hoping he wouldn't notice the trembling in my hands. Ben looked away, but I saw his jaw clench. "Sorry, I shouldn't have said that." "It's okay," I replied quietly. "Sometimes you're too perceptive for your age." He smiled faintly, but his gaze remained sad. "It's just, you seem unhappy." Those words hit me harder than I wanted to show. Unhappy. I hadn't thought about it so frankly before, but at that moment I couldn't deny the truth. I stood up, feeling something inside me tremble, and went into the house, leaving him alone on the porch. But even in the living room, I felt his presence. Not physical, but something else, barely perceptible, but just as real. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. The voice of reason tried to remind me that it all should have ended on that couch, but it didn't end. It was just beginning. Everything collapsed in one day. Mark came home earlier than usual. His face was tense, his movements sharp and nervous. I heard the front door slam and immediately knew something was wrong. "Emma!" His voice was like a clap of thunder. I came out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on my apron, and froze. Mark stood in the middle of the living room, his face burning with anger. In his hand, he held his phone. I managed to notice that the screen was open to messages. He turned to me, and in his gaze there was no trace of his usual detachment, only pain and hatred. "What happened?" My voice trembled despite all my efforts to stay calm. "You mean nothing happened?" Mark stepped towards me, his steps quick and threatening. "I'll give you a chance to tell the truth." "One chance, Emma." My heart was beating so hard I could barely breathe. I looked at the phone in his hand and felt a wave of horror wash over me. "I don't understand." "You don't understand?" he roared, throwing the phone onto the table. It hit the surface with a dull thud. "These looks, these disappearances, this disgusting silence, and you still dare to say you don't understand?" I took a step back, but he kept advancing. "Mark, wait. Don't you dare lie to me now." He spun around and shouted upstairs, "Ben!" I froze. I couldn't believe this was happening. Ben appeared from around the corner. His face was pale, but his gaze was steady. He already knew. He knew this moment was inevitable. "What's going on?" Ben asked calmly, though his fists were clenched. Mark laughed, bitterly, loudly, almost hysterically. "No need for this drama, Ben. I know everything. Your sweet friend Hannah was kind enough to share with me, with all these little details." He picked up the phone and scrolled through the screen, showing photos and screenshots of messages. "You know what's most disgusting? I didn't want to believe it for a long time. My head spun and my breath caught. "Mark, please," I whispered. He turned to me, his eyes flashing. "Please, you want me to forget this? To pretend you didn't betray me? That you, Emma, my wife, got involved with him? With my son?" "It's not like that," Ben began, but Mark wasn't listening anymore. "You were silent," Mark shouted, pointing at him. You were silent while I worked, while I trusted both of you. You betrayed me, Ben. And you, he turned his gaze to me, and his voice suddenly became cold. You betrayed everything that was between us. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. Get out, he said so quietly that it was scarier than shouting. Both of you, get out of my house. Mark, please. I tried to approach him, but he recoiled as if I were poisonous. Not another word, Emma. His voice trembled, and I saw tears in his eyes. Just go. Ben stood motionless. He looked at Mark and me as if trying to decide what to do, but it was all over. Let's go, Ben said quietly, reaching out his hand to me. I looked at him, then at Mark. In my husband's eyes, there was pain that made me want to scream. It was the pain of betrayal, of a break, of the collapse of our entire life. I began, but he turned away. I don't care what you wanted. Just go. Ben and I packed our things in silence. I don't remember exactly how it happened. Everything blurred into chaos. Things fell from my hands, my gaze was clouded with tears. I felt Mark's gaze on me as he stood by the door like a sentry, seeing us off into nowhere. When we stepped outside, Ben put his hand on my shoulder, but I immediately pulled away. Not now, I exhaled. We got into the car, and I looked back one last time. Mark stood in the doorway of our house, the house that no longer belonged to me. His face was impassive, but I knew this moment had broken him. You betrayed me, both of you. His words echoed in my head. When Ben started the engine, I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead against the glass. It was all over. Emptiness came immediately after the shock. In the first days after leaving the house, I lived on autopilot, barely understanding where I was going and why. Our things were scattered in a cheap motel that smelled of mustiness and old wood. Ben had rented us a room, but we barely spoke. He sat by the window smoking and looking into the distance as if searching for something beyond the horizon, and I sat on the bed, clutching my phone and not daring to write to anyone I could trust. But there were no such people left. 2 days later, Ben left. He didn't say where he was going or when he would return. He just packed his things into his backpack and paused for a moment in the doorway, his dark eyes looking at me. We both need time, he said quietly. And what will you do? I asked bitterly. He didn't answer. Instead, he whispered, I'm sorry. The door slammed shut, and the room became even quieter. I didn't know what was worse, staying close to him, reminding each other of the destruction, or sitting here alone, trying to piece together what couldn't be fixed. Months passed one after another, like colorless days. I found myself a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city, which I paid for from my savings. It was half empty, a mattress on the floor, a small kitchen table, and a lonely chair by the window. An old radio was my only luxury. It hissed and only caught local channels, but sometimes it found classical music. I listened to it in the evenings, trying to drown out the silence. Friends stopped calling, maybe because of the rumors Hannah spread, maybe because they just didn't know how to talk to me. Once I met Lily in the supermarket. She froze, looking at me with pity and condemnation at the same time. Emma, she said. Lily. My voice was quiet. She opened her mouth to say something but changed her mind. She only added, take care of yourself. Those words sounded like a farewell. I got a job at an art supply store. It was ironic. My life was ruined, but now I was selling paints and brushes to those trying to create something. The first days passed in a haze, but one day, during lunch break, I noticed a white canvas in the window. I bought it along with a set of acrylic paints and a couple of brushes. When I got home, I put the canvas against the wall and just looked at it. What if I try? I muttered to myself. The first strokes were awkward, uncertain. I hadn't painted since college, since the days when I still dreamed of becoming an artist. But each new layer of paint brought a strange, almost forgotten relief. I painted what I felt. Emptiness, fear, then warm light breaking through the darkness. Canvases quickly filled the walls of the apartment. It was my way of talking to myself. One morning I found a letter in the mailbox. It lay there like an unwelcome ghost from the past. The handwriting was familiar. Ben. I stood in the entrance for several minutes before daring to open the envelope. Emma, I thought for a long time whether to write to you. Maybe it's selfish, but I didn't want our story to end in silence. I know I left only ruins behind. Forgive me for that. I don't regret what happened between us, but I understand that we destroyed more than we created. I went far away. I work in a small town by the ocean. It seems that for the first time in a long time, I can breathe freely. I hope you find peace too. We need to let each other go, Emma, but know that you are a part of me that will stay forever. Ben. My fingers trembled as I finished reading the letter. I sat down on the chair and closed my eyes. It hurt, but this pain was different. Not sharp, but liberating. Goodbye, Ben, I whispered. I went to the window and looked out. The world kept moving forward. People were rushing somewhere. Cars drove by. I thought that life is a series of moments, and each teaches us something important. A year later, my apartment looked different. Canvases were neatly arranged along the walls, some of them sold in a local gallery. I started writing notes about my past, not as a confession, but as an attempt to understand myself. At the opening of my first solo exhibition, I stood by the wall where my favorite painting hung, warm rays of sunrise breaking through the clouds. A middle-aged woman approached and looked at the canvas for a long time. There's something special in this, she said, turning to me. Like hope. I'm glad you see it. I smiled. When the gallery emptied, I stayed alone. The light in the hall was dimmed, and I sat on a chair, looking at my works. I no longer felt emptiness. My past was there, on those canvases, but it no longer defined me. I realized, despite the mistakes, despite the pain, I had survived. And this was the beginning of something new. I went outside, breathed in the cold evening air, and smiled. Life went on, and there was something more ahead.